Um, Welcome everyone. This spring semester, I hosted a workshop with a group of Yale graduate students. It took as its subject Roadshow, Travel Papers in American Literature, an exhibition I curated and organized from the Yale Collection of American Literature, and Imaginary Voyages, a companion exhibition curated by my colleague Tim Young, curator of modern books and manuscripts at the Beinecke. Initially scheduled to open in May of 2020, when the exhibitions were canceled and rescheduled and then canceled again, my friend and colleague Karen Rothman suggested planning a public humanities research project to consider the situation we found ourselves in. This is how I described it in my initial invitation to join the workshop. Your cultural institution plans a major exhibition from its permanent collections, but there's a public health crisis that prevents you from welcoming visitors into the building. How do you make the most of the exhibition within necessary limits? With the collaboration of several Beinecke and Yale Library colleagues, the Roadshow at Beinecke Library website was created. The website is the workshop's online gallery. There's also a toolkit, including all the text, images, research materials, and curatorial resources that my colleagues and I could assemble under the circumstances. Roadshow workshop students started from writing and research prepared for the in-person exhibitions. They quickly reimagined and expanded that work, considering materials in their academic fields, American and African American literature and history, French history, religious studies, environmental studies, theater studies, and more, applying their expertise and their curiosity to travel-related themes across the Beinecke Library's collections. Students are in the process of making their own online micro exhibitions, which will be posted to our website in the coming days. And that work in progress will be the subject of their presentations today and next Monday. Go to the next slide, please, Michael. Before I turn the program over to the student curators, I'd like to thank my collaborators. They are Melissa Barton, Megan Chekai, Michael Morand, Miriam Olivares, Karen Rothman, Carrie Sancombe, and Tim Young. They're all terrific. And one more slide, Michael. I'm delighted to introduce today's presenters, Kelsey Champagne, Abigail Fields, Brittney Levingston, and Stephanie McAbee. We'll all be delighted to answer your questions after the final presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, let's turn to Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for this workshop. And thank you everyone who's tuning in. I am a PhD candidate in the departments of History and Renaissance Studies. I'm in my final year, so I've submitted the dissertation, which has allowed me to focus a lot of energy onto this exhibition. And I took a lot of inspiration from Imaginary Voyages and thinking about the ways that historically writers and artists and thinkers have conceptualized of spaces that don't exist or that might exist and we haven't quite stumbled upon yet. So thinking about how this applies to my own research field, I decided immediately to start thinking about Jonathan Swift's Gullivers Travels. So if Michael, if you could go to the next slide. Gullivers Travels was published in 1726 by an Irishman named Jonathan Swift. It's a fictional story of a mariner named Gulliver who finds himself stranded on a variety of islands around the world through a series of many different events. And on these places, he encounters giants and people under 6 inches tall. He meets magicians and ghosts and philosophers. He meets talking horses and domesticated human creatures. That all help him to reconceptualize his understanding of his own place in the world and his own society. And this was intended as a commentary on European society, as well as European political structures, and a satire of an increasingly popular genre of travel literature, which was proliferating around Europe, beginning really in the late 16th century as explorers went east and west all over the globe. If you could go to the next slide. So these are two examples of these kinds of travel literature pieces. On the left is a report from Jesuit priests who went to Southeast Asia and sent back observations about the landscape that they saw there, the flora, the fauna, but also the people, their rights, their food, their customs, their dress, their political etiquette, everything that they observed. And this kind of text was extremely popular. You could find it of places all over the world as not only missionary priests, but also secular explorers went out and stumbled upon new cultures that they hadn't experienced yet, different indigenous groups and reported back the differences between their own society and the societies that they encountered in a way that was at the time quite ethnographic, strikingly prejudiced and biased now, particularly some of the images, the language of savage, which is something that we can talk about. And on the right is a fictionalized version of this travel literature genre, the very famous Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, which was published in 1722. And Robinson Crusoe was designed as a diary written by the title character as he was stranded on a private island, just himself and his slave. And it follows his survival techniques and also the fictional indigenous people that he encountered. And both of these kinds of texts, so specifically Defoe, as well as the larger genre of travel literature, were huge influences on Jonathan Swift. Next slide, please. So travel narratives were crucial to shaping people's understanding of their physical and intellectual place in an ever-expanding world. But equally important were maps for understanding that much more visually. So all 4 of these maps were created in the 15 years leading up to the publication of Gullivers Travels. So these depict a world that Jonathan Swift was very much familiar with. And you can see latitude and longitude lines, navigation lines, topographical markers, illustrations of animals and plants, man-made sites, natural sites that you might encounter in each of these places around the world. So these are really expressions of physical and human landscapes of the world that all of a sudden Europeans had access to and could explore. Next slide. This map, by contrast, is pretty stark. All we have is an island and the rough outline of a coast. There's no details, no navigation lines. You have a small drawing of a fish and of a ship that kind of harken back to those genuine maps. But this really is an empty space. And this is a map from Gulliver's Travels. So it's the final island that Gulliver traveled to. And you can feel this sense that this is an imaginary space. We have no kind of context. We only know where this island is in relation to the coastline. That is also imagined. And so what's important is not the location of Gulliver's imaginary voyages. It's not where he went, but the lessons that they provide and the critiques that they inspire. And here we really see this map as being entirely dislocated from the rest of the world. This is not something we can look at and know where we are in relation to this space. And I think that that's a real testament of the fact that it's an imaginary space. Next slide. So since its publication in 1726, Gulliver's Travels was never out of print. It still continues to be in print. And it has inspired so many different artistic works, literary works, film works. It's really created a whole world around itself. And these are 2 political cartoons by James Gilray in 1803 and 1804. And Gilray has been called the father of the political cartoon. So this is really the moment when we're starting to see the emergence of this kind of caricature being mobilized in a political way. And these are 2 scenes taken directly out of Gulliver's Travels. They're some of the most salient scene when he's on an island occupied by giants, and they're obsessed with his tiny stature. They are really entertained by him. And here, Gulliver is styled as Napoleon, and the king is styled as King George III. And so Gilray uses the iconic and intimately familiar story of Gulliver's Travels to satirize the Napoleonic Wars and to create this new kind of genre of critiquing politics in a fun and somewhat lighthearted way. Next slide. This is an example of an 1899 reimagining of the story of Gulliver's Travels. It's from the Henry Altemus Publishing House, which republished literary classics using exclusively single syllable words. So here we have the essence of the story. We have these wonderful images, but much of the political and social commentary has been exchanged. And instead, what we focus on is the humor and the wit and the adventure and the story of Gulliver's Travels, marketed at a different kind of audience, maybe an audience of children or young adults, and it's meant to be much more entertaining and far less serious. Next slide. And that's kind of taken to the extreme in the Hollywood film from 2010, which is absolutely aimed at children. It's just a fun movie, but it also speaks to the our enduring interest in these imaginary spaces. And ultimately, what Gullivers Travels has become about is adventure, encounter of cultural difference, and being able to rethink of our own society through the lens of cultures undiscovered. So my final slide. I've come away with this with a new appreciation, I think, for this genre, and understanding that stories of imaginary voyages are full of adventure and creativity, and they're fun. They transport the reader to magical places, whether they're on this earth or another, connect us to a broader world, and offer insight into the successes and shortcomings of our own very real communities. And while Gulliver's Travels was originally written as a satire, it's really warmed the hearts for the centuries that it's been consistently in print. And as we read this travelogue, we journey right alongside Gulliver into the most remote, most unusual, and sometimes absurd corners of a world undiscovered. So thank you very much.
Okay, I will take over. I apologize in advance if I'm realizing now that I made this on Keynote, but presented it on or exported as PowerPoint. So it's possible that we'll have some slight technical difficulties, but I hope that that will not be the case. Yeah, so my name is Abigail. I'm a doctoral student in the French department. As you can see from this title slide, I won't be talking about French studies today, but will instead be talking about a subject. There's some tie-ins as a sneak peek, but I'll instead be talking about a topic that is much kind of closer to my life and my heart, which is the American prairie. So when asked, I would say that I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, but in many ways I was raised on the prairie. I lived in Kansas until I was 8, and I spent a lot of time in rural South Dakota. And so while I don't have many conscious memories from that time in my life, I do have a deep emotional attachment to that land and kind of the way I feel on it. And I've kind of taken this as an experimental mode to explore that in kind of scholarly work as well. So this kind of relationship with this space is perhaps why I had a kind of complicated reaction to the portrayal of the prairie in American literature of the 19th century, and a course that I took in my first semester here at Yale with Professor Michael Warner. Countless American authors have represented the prairie in both positive and negative terms, I should note, as a natural space that is distinct from, if not antithetical to, any notion of civilization. The prairie is sometimes presented as a void of life, compared to deserts or bodies of water to be either traversed or mastered, broken, civilized. Other times it's a bountiful garden full of life, but still external to other than human. As the poet William Cullen Bryant says in his poem, "The Prairies," and I'm quoting, "Man hath no part in this glorious work." But many of these literary renderings are the reflections of travelers, passers through the prairie, either there on the way somewhere else, or as a part of a conceived of project to document the particularities of this place. What then might the difference be between those looking in at the prairie and those looking out from it? And how do these portrayals shift when they are imbued with some other bias, as is the case in documents created to draw settlers to this land? As we grapple with these questions, we also have to acknowledge two important things. First, that the land was never devoid of human life, or at least was not in this period. And this erasure of indigenous civilization and community, the denial of their humanness, was part and parcel to the colonization of the American West. And the second related reality to contend with is that the prairie was witness to a large-scale ecological settlement project. Man was encouraged to have a part not in the glorious work of nature or of the natural prairie ecosystem, but in different work counter to this landscape, that of single crop agriculture. So this history can't be removed from representations of the prairie. Indeed, as eco-critical scholar Annabella Patterson would remind us, landscape is always ideological. So ideologies of the prairie, ways of seeing with it, ways of seeing it and ways of living with it and on it are the crux of my micro exhibition. And today I'm going to kind of rapid fire through a variety of documents that I'd be happy to talk more about in the Q&A or not. But the documents that the majority of which will be present or are present in the Beinecke collections that have been particularly useful as I tease this out. And I do want to just note this is a work in progress, so I'm very happy to talk about things or receive pushback at the end as well. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this map dates from the 1830s when the French thinker and diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville toured the United States. So here's the kind of tie-in to French studies. The map was contained in his 2-volume work of the same title, a project that informed his political engagement in the French context. So it's called Democracy in America. And what I want to highlight here, if you want to go to the next slide, please, is this line, which he draws through present-day Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota, which kind of describes everything west of this line as largely uninhabited desert. So he does note indigenous tribes, but does call it all a desert. This association with the desert, so thinking about Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, they're not deserts, they're prairies. And this association with the desert is not only incorrect for much of the space, but problematic, as some critics, including Jill Jarvis, an assistant professor in the French department here, have noted. The desert is often considered a space of nothingness through which one might pass in order to arrive at a worthy destination. And this idea of the void has led governments in the modern era to engage in practices such as atomic bomb testing in desert spaces. So while I don't want to go into this at this time, the representation of Prairie as a desert, which is pretty widespread, has contributed to its understanding as a blank canvas, easily overlooked and just as easily settled, mastered, dominated. And if you want to go to the next slide, I just included this to show how important this map was. So we saw the translation of it into English. There's also been a translation of it into Spanish. So although it was originally rendered in French, kind of for a French audience, it has proved to be somewhat widespread and largely influential. Next slide, please. Here we might consider a more visual representation of the story told by Tocqueville's map. In this vernacular photograph, of whose origins we can't be completely certain, but it's dated to the last decade of the 19th century, we see 3 men on a relatively bleak, flat prairie, devoid of any flowering plants that we may culturally associate with bounty. The title suggests that there are indeed no signs of life found, right, that we're looking for, but that we haven't necessarily found signs of life on the prairie, despite the house on the left, or the right, sorry, I'm not good at directions, the right, which suggests a level of settlement. I'm especially interested here in the westward orientation of the telescope, looking away from the established structure and looking toward the west, right? So the kind of geographical target and center of the notion of manifest destiny, and obviously of westward expansion. And then if we go to the next slide, in this next piece, a woodcut from the middle of the century, so quite a bit earlier, but I still kind of think that this juxtaposition is interesting, or at least generative for me. We see this perspective reversed. So now looking at the city of Chicago from the prairie space, the city whose industrial capacity is highlighted by the proliferation of steaming chimneys is kind of central here. And the pastoral foreground, the cattle grazing, suggests that civilization is not, perhaps contrary to popular belief at the time, impossible in the prairie, but can indeed coexist with a prairie ecosystem and also agrarian ways of life. So we kind of see some flowering here, and then we see the agrarian tradition represented through the cattle. But this view does not come without its bias, right? So although we do not know the provenance of this piece, it was used as a frontispiece for a business periodical, a forum in which many land and railroad companies advertised. So with that in mind, and kind of with this portrayal of the prairie as being kind of friendly to whatever notions of civilization were kind of attractive in this time, I want to now turn to some kind of more explicit advertising. So on the next slide, we're turning toward company advertisements for free or reasonably priced land. And so we see attention here. If you want to go to the next slide, please. We have a little zoom up. It might still be hard to read, sorry. I'm going to quote from it. So we see special attention paid to portraying the prairie as inhabitable and, more importantly, already inhabited. So in the blown up text here, the potential settler is reassured that he, quote, has not to wait for conveniences of civilization, but has at hand the advantages of railroad, telegraph, daily mail, markets, mercantile interests, schools, churches, etc., end quote. The emphasis on community, it says at some point, come make a home. Home is italicized here. It is also striking, in contrast to many popular representations of pioneering as quite a solitary experience undertaken by a family or perhaps a group of families, but not necessarily as a community endeavor. On the next slide, this document, like the preceding one is an advertisement enticing settlers to buy land. What's particularly interesting here is the featuring of crops, the captions of which highlight yield. So this again suggests that the West is a place of bounty. Here, however, with the presence of men in the middle of the field breaking the horizon line quite often, and the agricultural crop, the bounty is decidedly not natural, or at least not only natural, but in part man-made or man-cultivated. In the last minutes I have, I want to turn very briefly to internal perspectives of the prairie, which is something that I'm kind of thinking more about and trying to tease more out of the archive. So I think a lot of similar elements are at play here, but trying to think through how and why this specific production was created and perpetuated has been interesting. So on the next slide, the next two slides, so we'll stay here for a moment and then travel. There are some images taken by William Henry Jackson. While Jackson was born in New York, he moved to Omaha in 1866 and remained in the Midwest for the majority of his life until his death in 1942. These photos, so maybe we can go to the next slide, are a series that Jackson made on South Dakota. The photos depict agricultural labor and do not show a wild prairie landscape. Still, the balance in both photos and the framing of them and the expansive landscape visible in both, especially in this second, gives us a notion of belonging on even to the land, so kind of an equilibrium. These photos are pastoral or at the very least Georgic, but I would argue seemingly not in the way as the Chicago woodcut we saw earlier, so not kind of from the same bias. And then very briefly, I just want to touch at the end here on the next slide. The last question that I'm kind of working through with this project is what it means to have a personal attachment to this space and also a family history with it. So the text pictured here is a book made in the town in which my mother grew up, which she happened to help copy edit and typeset while working at the town newspaper in high school. This document, which I found in my grandmother's house, is part of a family archive of sorts. So thinking about how to incorporate documents such as these, which do have some historical interest, as we'll see on the next slide, has been a really important part of this work and one that's been challenging, though very enriching. And it's kind of led me to believe that our strength as scholars and kind of my strength as a curator in this exhibit is not through an objective critical distance, but through a kind of empathetic, honest, and patient approach to the work and to the archives. And I'm out of time, but I just want to quickly highlight here like a kind of tension in that, and one that I'd be very happy to talk about in this space or others, is that I think that these are historically interesting photographs of a town, and also it's a town that I spent a lot of time in my childhood and can recognize like my own experience, especially based on these top photographs, in that I can situate myself. I like know exactly the vantage point that these are taken from. So kind of thinking about where I exist in the exhibit and in the archive. Thank you so much for paying attention.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. So initially, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Nancy Cool, whose micro exhibit, I Best Not Linger Here, James Baldwin in Birmingham, Alabama, provided the letter, which we will see at the end of my presentation, that kickstarted my research. So my exhibit will focus mainly on the letters that writer James Baldwin sent to his friend, economist Mary Garren Painter, over the course of his stops in North Carolina and Alabama. I should also introduce myself. I'm Brittney Levingston. I'm a recent graduated last year from the PhD program in English and African American Studies, and I'm currently the fellowship program manager at the Beinecke. So continuing, in the fall of 1957, nearly a year after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott and 3 years after the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, declared segregation in American schools unconstitutional, Baldwin embarked on a trip through the South, interviewing activists, students, and families about their experiences with the early stages of desegregation. Baldwin had already contributed to magazines such as Harper's and the Partisan Review as a foreign correspondent. Leaving France, which is where he was to write his many novels that he wrote, such as Go Tell on the Mountain and Another Country, were completed while he was living in France. But leaving France to return to the United States for this assignment to go through the South should have been a homecoming of sorts. But Harlem-born and well-traveled 33-year-old Baldwin had never been to the South, even as he understood himself as an American native son. Baldwin's trip would produce essays that eventually would be collected in Nobody Knows My Name, an essay collection, where he discussed his terror of the South and his sense while visiting of being a foreigner in his own country. Quote, a Negro born in the North who finds himself in the South is in a position similar to that of the son of the Italian immigrant who finds himself in Italy. Both are in countries they have never seen, but which they cannot fail to recognize. So this presented an interesting case that I wanted to explore. As I mentioned, Baldwin had traveled widely, but as for this trip to the South, he would also be a foreign correspondent of sorts, a stranger in his own homeland, terrified of the South that terrorized his mother and father, and that was in turmoil at the time. These letters chronicling Baldwin's trip, his increasing illness over the course of the trip, and his distress, even more so than the essays that would come of his trip, would show Baldwin as learning more about his own country and giving a close up view of how violently it was changing during the mid century. So, on to the next slide, please. So this letter, which I'm realizing that is a little difficult to read, but the letter itself is actually a letter he wrote to Garen Painter from Corsica. And it's basically just describing him as a sort of foreign correspondent. He's in Corsica to write a letter for Holiday about the island of Corsica. And so his sort of sense of being a foreign correspondent in that way. And so I included it in this just to give a sense of Baldwin as that writer, writing these essays, going to traveling around the world in this case to present to different audiences his work. So we can move on to the next slide. So this is a little later in the year, in October of 1957, the first year, and that he is in the first one of his early stops during the South is a letter from Charlotte, North Carolina, a very short letter in which he basically requests from his friend Garen Painter that she send a copy of his essay collection, Notes of a Native Son, to Gus Roberts, a student he interviews for his essay that would be published in Nobody Knows My Name, called A Fly in the Buttermilk. Basically asking her to please send this to him. And in the essay and in the margins of the letter, Baldwin notes that from a population of about 50,000 Black people in Charlotte, North Carolina, only 45 applications were received to attempt to desegregate the schools. And only 4 students actually ended up going to different schools around Charlotte to desegregate them. A consequence, certainly, of the threats and intimidation faced by Black students and families after Brown versus Board began the process of desegregation. The letter indicates that Baldwin's interview with the family and his experience with Charlotte left him, quote, greatly troubled in his mind and in his head and in his heart as he continued his journey through the South, worrying about how his essay that will come of this trip will communicate, quote, the story the nation is writing. It's a killer diller. So moving on to the next slide. So the next letter we get from Baldwin on this trip is from Tuskegee, and this is a selection from this letter. This letter is about 7 pages, and so it's really long and kind of giving us a little bit better of a sense of how he felt after leaving Charlotte and his kind of early stops through Alabama. He writes this letter after having traveled to Tuskegee from Montgomery, and so he describes meeting Martin Luther King Jr. and Reverend Ralph Abernathy after the end of the Montgomery bus boycotts. But what's really interesting about this letter is him describing very keenly his sense of white citizens in Alabama struggling against the impending desegregation. So he describes the shift he sees in the ways white people are responding to this desegregation and the burgeoning civil rights movement, and writes that the schools and the white citizenry of the South are, quote, compelled to keep trying to resist and add blood to blood. And so is increasingly distressed by the violence and the anger and distress that he sees among white citizenry in Tuskegee and the danger that that is posed to not only himself as traveling through the South, but also to the citizens who live in Tuskegee and Montgomery and are continually fighting against these different forces. So we can go to the next slide. So this is the envelope from his next stop that he goes to Birmingham, and is from the hotel, the A.G. Gaston Motel, which was a Black-owned motel, safe haven. And so I wanted to show you all this, one, because it's a good image to sort of break up all these letters, but also to sort of get a sense of where Baldwin was in Birmingham. The A.G. Gaston Motel was a Black-owned motel. what you could find in the Green Book, which you may be familiar with as a sort of guidebook for Black people who are traveling through the South in particular, to find safe places to eat, to house themselves, to find, in this case, the envelope and an advertisement, which you can go to the next slide as well, will indicate, and it has air conditioning, which I imagine even in October in Alabama is very warm. Being a Southern person myself, I'm sure Baldwin was very grateful for at his visit. So I wanted to show you these images because it's giving an image of a sort of what's supposed to be a sort of safe haven in a place like Birmingham, Alabama, but it's still increasingly scary for Baldwin. And so if you can go to the next slide. So this is the final letter we have between that Baldwin sends to Garen Painter during his trip from Birmingham, again on the stationery from the Gaston Motel. And in this letter, we see Baldwin again is increasingly sick and despondent. In Birmingham, his experience as a foreign correspondent draws out this critical realization comes towards the end of the letter, quote, "This poor country, nobody seems to give a damn about it. I've never in my life been on a sadder journey or through a sadder country, not even Germany or Spain compare to it." And so saddened by this journey, Baldwin lays out the rest of his trip and his excitement to return to Garen Painter's, quote, "spectacularly integrated house," and finally leave the South, a country which, quote, "is busy preparing its doom." And so what I had hoped to give viewers of that micro exhibit a sense of is sort of Baldwin's distress and sort of what it might have been like for him as a writer who is known for being incredibly incisive about the American condition and race relations in this country, being terrified in one sense, but also learning a great deal and having to see his own country through the eyes of as in the same kind of way he might approach the island of Corsica, and writing about how do I write about this place, even as he has familial and connections to the South and historical connections to the South, and understands its place in the grand scheme of American society, but the difficulty in approaching that, and how even the essays don't quite capture his sense of fear, the worry and the concern, and the prophetic nature, I think, of seeing that in 1957, the civil rights movement is going in full swing. We haven't even gotten, of course, to the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, the March on Washington, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. All of these things haven't happened yet. And so the South is on fire and will be on fire, and figuratively and literally for the next decade. And Baldwin is seeing the beginning embers of that and are chronicling that in these letters. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Maccabee. I'm in the Religious Studies department, and broadly, I'm interested in the intersection of religion, cultural heritage, memory, and conflict. I'm very thankful to be here today. And so for my micro exhibition, I wanted to see if I could continue to explore and expand my knowledge of religion, applying this idea of roadshow and the related concepts. So when I began to explore the collections catalog, I used religion as a search word and just wanted to see what would come up when I applied this term and how it overlapped with travel papers or some aspect of roadshow. And I came across many maps that had some aspect of religion integrated in them, but which were doing very different things. So some were mapping out the world's religions, which you can see an example of this as my background. Some were missionary maps, some were identifying religious groups for nation building purposes, some were using religion to highlight diversity and unity, etc. So my micro exhibition is quite broad in the sense that it's using or approaching this concept of religion maps. So in what ways do religion and maps intersect? So for my exhibit, I narrowed down to 4 objects. And these objects touch on themes of identity, diversity, and global mindsets, and hence the name of my exhibition title. So this is a screenshot from my story map micro exhibition. My approach for my presentation today is a little bit different in that because I'm doing approaching this topic that's quite wide. Trying to figure out my narrative in my micro exhibition has been a bit of a challenge. So I wanted to speak a few minutes about that before diving into some of my objects. This comes with any exhibition. There's always going to be challenges, and one of those is learning how to use your own voice, or what kind of voice do you portray in your exhibition. And so for the moment, in the text that I do have, I offer some broad information about my objects as a kind of introduction to them, but mostly I opt to get the visitor thinking by ending a lot of my labels with a question. So because this mode kind of aligns more with how I approach museums as institutions that teach people how to think and question the world. I'm not sure if it makes for a successful way of approaching an exhibition, just asking questions, making the reader, the visitor, do the work themselves, but this is a nice avenue to test that out. So when I go on the job market, I'll be better informed. And this is also one of the advantages of the digital form, is that I can keep working towards this micro exhibition, and that's what I plan to do as I receive feedback. The other challenge is having a through line. I have 4 objects that are doing very different things. They're from different time periods. They were produced in different parts of the world. And so there's not really a narrative, and I didn't want to fix a narrative. So rather, again, I asked this big question. I'm all about the questions. My exhibition asks, what do maps do? And what do maps do with religion? So my objects therefore provide insight into the many ways that maps can engage with this concept of religion. And I'm sure there's many other ways that I don't look at in my micro exhibition. As I will show in a moment, maps categorize people, maps advocate ideals, and they inform the way we see and understand and navigate the world we inhabit. So now look at a few examples of this. Next slide, please. I have, as I mentioned, 4 objects. 2 are world maps. One is a missionary map, and one is what I'm calling a tolerance map. And on the PowerPoint, you can see right now, it's a working introduction to my 18th and 19th century world maps. So one of my objects is called a map monde, or also known as a world map. And it's a map of the known, of course, but also sometimes imagined world. So what I found most fascinating when doing my research on world maps is this concept of speculative geography. Perhaps some of you are more familiar with this. This was something that was new to me. But of course, so map makers relied on a variety of sources to make their maps, but sometimes they had to speculate about certain parts of the world. And you can see this in the first map of my micro exhibition, and also on the next slide, please. So this map, so you have the full map on the left-hand side. This map represents, well, obviously the world, but you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, Australia, and it's not quite, it doesn't quite have the shape as we know it today. And so this is kind of, this is evidence of this kind of speculative geography. So again, I'm approaching this material as, what do maps do? What can we glean from these maps? But again, I also want to focus on the religion aspect. So in terms of the religion aspect of this particular map, you can see that it maps out the world's population along only 4 religions, as seen in the map legend, which is on the right-hand side. This is a zoomed in version of what's in the top left-hand corner. So you can see that it reduces all religions to either Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or this catch-all of paganism. So what I tried to highlight in my micro exhibition, and as you can see from the written excerpt, is that map legends can themselves be rich in information. So here I say legends do not merely tell us how to read maps, they also tell us something about the mindset of those who produce these maps and the worldview they embodied. And so thinking about how they reduce or how they categorize people along religions, below that you can see they also organize people along skin color lines. So it kind of gives us some insight into those who produce these maps. And as I mentioned, at the end of every object label, I ask a question. And here what I'm asking is, why was religion important to map out? And I don't provide an answer, though as I continue to develop this, I might want to suggest some ideas, but I don't think there is necessarily one answer, and it can be doing a lot of different things. So this is one example of what maps and religion look like when they intersect. So for the next slide, please, this is a map that does something completely different. This map was produced around the time of the Second World War by the Council Against Intolerance in America, an organization based in New York. During this time period, as we can still see today, immigration was thought to threaten the country. And so this map intended to celebrate America's ethnic and religious diversity by depicting people laboring, contributing to the country, and identifying those people. That's a bit hard to tell in the PowerPoint, but those red ribbons indicate from what country they come from and what religion, what their religious background is. Next slide, please, which will be my final slide. In more densely populated areas such as Chicago or in the northeastern states, pop-out keys, which is, there's an example of this on the left-hand side. They show a large variety of national and cultural backgrounds. And on that map in the bottom right-hand corner, and what is depicted on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint, there is a Native American in a headdress. The quotation acknowledges that aside from the Indian, Americans originate from other countries. And so this map forgoes state borderlines to promote a sense of unity among the nation. So again, intended to celebrate diversity during a complicated time during the Second World War. And so it served as an educational poster, which is interesting to put it in conversation with some of the other maps in my micro exhibition. So these two examples provide some insight into the multiple ways that maps and religion intersect, and into how people of different time periods understood and used religion to understand the world around them. So thank you so much for listening.